The single biggest driver of reduced emissions in the United States has been fracking, because we made natural gas super affordable and abundant and easy to produce. And because of that, we dramatically slashed our emissions over the last 2 decades. Suddenly, Kamala Harris, it probably has something to do with her being in Pennsylvania, but there's at least some value in her paying lip service to the fact that, suddenly she's pro-fracking. Yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in the state of Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman, joined by my co-host, Amy Cooke. And this week's episode is going to be a little bit different. It's a sort of a special edition because of the presidential debate that just occurred 2 days prior to us recording this episode. We've teased in the past that we want to do some kind of election and political coverage, just because whoever occupies the White House come November can have a pretty enormous outcome on not just national energy policy, but what happens right here in the state of Colorado. So every now and then in the lead up to the election, we do want to touch on those things. This was the first time that former President Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris have met and faced off in person to talk about some of the issues that are going to be animating this debate, and energy came up. So what was your takeaway from the candidates and their approach to energy?
Well, I was actually kind of disappointed that there was less talked about on energy.
Agreed.
Which, as we have talked on this show, how important it is and how it touches absolutely everything. So the big news, and this is no shock, 2019 then presidential candidate Kamala Harris was going far left and, oh yeah, I'm all in on a 100%, fracking ban. I'll ban fracking day. What she was a cheerleader to ban the procedure called hydraulic fracturing, by which we use in the United States and a lot here in Colorado.
Absolutely.
Weld County, where I live, home of 26,000 oil wells, and I'd say 99.9% of them have been hydraulically fractured. Not just once, but multiple times. And it has actually, hydraulic fracturing was part of the shale revolution. It was the shale revolution.
Yep.
And I would say hydraulic fracturing, but directional drilling. You could reduce the size of a well pad. It made producing oil from shale, but just producing oil and gas in general, so much more efficient. It was absolutely an incredible, innovative technique that we still use. But Kamala Harris in 2019, then as candidate for presidency, said going to ban fracking. She did not even hesitate on that question. She was all in on it. They asked her about it in the debate, and she said, "Oh yeah, no, I'm not for banning fracking, and I'll get to all the other things I flip-flopped on." And of course, she never did, and didn't even really go too much into why she has changed her mind on hydraulic fracturing, other than I'll just speculate. I think it was because she was in Pennsylvania, which relies on hydraulic fracturing for development in the Marcellus Shale in that formation. But she also she said this, that there's been more oil and gas production under Joe Biden administration, Biden-Harris administration, and she went all in on that. And what was interesting to me, again, I would have, if I'd been a moderator, come back and said, well, has that been on federal lands or has that been on private land? And that, of course, that's where it is. Any increase in oil and gas development or production in the United States has been on private land. The other thing they should have come back and said, well, you seem to be now pro oil and gas. Well, what about that LNG? What do they call it? A pause on the export terminal?
Yeah.
So she was allowed to say things that one was a complete flip-flop. That was number one. And number two, half truths at best. So there are a couple of other things too when you look at Kamala Harris, and then we'll talk about Donald Trump. But we have talked about this on the show. She views energy policy through the myopic lens of emissions. So when you look, she's now put it out there at least. I mean, at least we can have something to reference. Before we had to go back and look at, her tweets and look at what she said when she was on the campaign trail before, or also look at bills that she either sponsored or voted for or against in the Senate. But here's what she has said. Her projects are aimed at reducing carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. So she calls it her climate policy. It's not an energy policy, it is a climate policy. But I argue, and we have argued, that with the right energy policy, you get the best climate outcomes.
Sure.
So she could do that. Places like Utah and states that are embracing innovation and affordable, reliable power, they are going to see reduced emissions far sooner than, say, Colorado or California. Utah and a few other states are on the right path. Kamala Harris is following more of a California lead, and I would say a Colorado lead too, because this is what, as vice president, Harris advocates moving the country towards, this might give a little PTSD to some Coloradans, what she calls a clean energy economy, which is a throwback. Those of us who remember the 2006 gubernatorial race here, where then candidate Bill Ritter introduced the new energy economy. And what that was all about wind and solar, replacing baseload fossil fuels. And here we are now at this time where it seems like every week, Jake, there is a new headline about either Xcel Energy needs more money or Xcel Energy has power outages. All the things we predicted in 2010 under the new energy economy, 2006 is when that started, but when we really started getting into it in 2010, all of those things are coming to fruition now. Outages, that lack of reliability, the increase in cost, and that is what Kamala Harris is saying she wants to do. That is the crux of her energy policy, which she calls the clean energy economy, and it is focused on emissions.
Yep.
Now, that's different from Donald Trump.
Right. Before we get into Trump, I do want to touch on something you said, because I think it's very important. You mentioned that we can have innovative energy policy looked through the lens of energy policy first and foremost and still have good environmental outcomes. This goes back to the fracking point you made. Because of fracking, the single biggest driver of reduced emissions in the United States has been fracking, because we made natural gas super affordable and abundant and easy to produce. And because of that, we dramatically slashed our emissions over the last 2 decades. So maybe it's no wonder that suddenly Kamala Harris, it probably has something to do with her being in Pennsylvania, but there's at least some value in her paying lip service to the fact that, suddenly she's pro-fracking.
Yeah,
and fracking is good. And not only did it help reduce emissions, but it's also unlocking future innovations. We've talked about geothermal in a couple of past episodes. Enhanced geothermal, what they call it, has only been made possible by fracking, because it's essentially fracking for geothermal.
It's the same technique.
Yep.
It is the exact same technique. She's also in on this policy of let's electrify things. So let's plug more into the grid at the same time that she wants to see a reduction in baseload generation from coal and natural gas. Biden administration has been pro-nuclear. I'm not going to say they have been full-throated about it. Right. They aren't demanding that Congress go in and get rid of some of the red tape and let's unleash a nuclear renaissance.
But better than in Colorado, I would say.
Oh,
yeah.
That's exactly right. So Colorado's openly hostile to nuclear. Our legislature is. Our governor is not in favor of it. But at least the Biden administration with Vice President Harris has paid lip service to being supportive of nuclear energy.
Yeah, no, especially with Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm. She always tours nuclear plants and talks about how great it is and how it's producing reliable, clean energy. So there is value in that for sure.
Yeah.
Beginning to, you mentioned former President Donald Trump. He didn't get to touch on energy too much, I think, in his debate remarks, but on the campaign trail, he's certainly talked about unleashing American oil and gas production. That's been a huge theme of his. It's essentially a drill, baby, drill kind of strategy. And, he's not wrong. Right now is a key opportunity for producers across the United States and here in the state of Colorado to contribute not only to American energy security, but international energy security to our allies.
Right.
Weaning them off of dictators and autocracies that would otherwise be supplying these fossil fuels. I don't know. Did you hear anything else that he talked about at the debate?
No, I would say though the difference is she talks about it through the lens of climate. He talks about it through the lens of energy and energy production, and to all. And I would say all point. I'm not going to say all of the above because that's wrong. I would say all things that work: natural oil, natural gas, coal. I think if there's a President Trump, I think you're going to find a use for coal. I think coal you're not going to see this rapid, race to the bottom to shut down baseload coal. That if somebody wants to retire a coal plant that is at the end of its life cycle, then fine. But you're not going to see this race to shut down coal plants across the country. What I do think you'll see is innovation coming online to make coal even, cleaner, whatever that looks like. I don't know. There's carbon capture, sequestration, something like that. Nuclear, President Trump embraces nuclear. I think one of the things that you'll see, this doesn't necessarily impact Colorado, but it is certainly it will have a big impact on the country, at least along the eastern seaboard. And for the millions of folks that live over there, that live on that side, I think you'll see an examination of the effectiveness, meaning the efficiency, and also the cost effectiveness of offshore wind. I think that's going to be something that you're going to see with the Trump administration. And I think we should all welcome that. Because one of the things that we talked about before with FERC, they want to socialize transmission lines. Where some of those transmission lines are coming that we would be paying for are coming from offshore wind, which I can't imagine you want to drop fiberglass into the middle of the ocean and then run cables to it in salt water. Like there are a few things more corrosive.
Not only that, but some of the costs that you're seeing on these projects, $170 a megawatt hour.
Yeah, it is the most expensive way to power, to provide power. So I think you're going to see a difference there too. The other one on this, I think you'll see, President Trump has already said it, and it didn't come up. And this is what was so disappointing about this debate. It just didn't talk much about energy. And there was so much that both sides have discussed, and energy is in absolutely everything. Instead, we had just some of the dumbest questions about obscure comments. And I don't know, ABC should find, I think they were the biggest losers in the debate, but for instance, the electric vehicle mandates, the pushes for electric vehicles. We are a nation deeply in debt. Can we afford $7,500 for electric vehicles? But I guess even though we have those subsidies for electric vehicles, nobody's really buying them because there isn't a market for electric vehicles yet. And the difference would be, the Harris administration wants to keep that going, which of course is the $7,500 subsidy from the feds. And you match that with Colorado, you're at $12,500. It's a lot of money. But under a Trump administration, Donald Trump has said that the automakers should be essentially responding to market demand. And if market demand isn't there for EVs, he's not going to be the one that throws a bunch of money at it to make people essentially transition people from your internal combustion engine to your electric vehicle. So fewer things plugged into the grid, which is already unstable as it is.
No, it's a great point, and it's something that he's hit on definitely on the campaign trail, but I would have liked to see that come up more in the debate.
They didn't talk about that
Same
at all.
with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Oh,
Kamala Harris brought it up a couple of times, mentioning her general outlook on climate policy and energy policy. But you want to talk about money sloshing around, that I believe she cast the tie-breaking vote for that in the Senate.
She did.
So obviously there's a tie there. But two are increasingly tricky, I'll put it nicely, tricky fiscal environment that we face. We've seen projections from like folks like Travis Fisher at the Cato Institute that this could cost something like $3 trillion when all is said and done, just because of the open-ended tax credits. I would have liked to see some sort of discussion about what that looks like under either a Harris administration, we can assume that would continue, or a Trump administration. We could see perhaps some efforts to, pull back some of those subsidies or adjust some of those subsidies. I don't know. I would have definitely liked to seen that come up, I think, in the debate, because that's such a big deal.
100%. Because those tricky fiscal situations, let's call it unstable.
Yeah.
A little instability there. Here's the other thing on this too. Pushing back on that for sure. The other one is, we touched on it a little bit earlier. I speculated it's because she's in Pennsylvania. I seriously want to know why she thinks she has flipped on banning fracking. I welcome it.
Sure.
I welcome it, but I don't trust it.
Yeah.
I don't actually believe that. I don't believe that she has suddenly embraced hydraulic fracturing. She now realizes how important it is that you can have a clean environment and embrace hydraulic fracturing. I don't believe that for one moment.
Yeah, I would have definitely liked to see a more thorough articulation of, the journey she's been on, let's put it on that particular position, because I know I touched on it briefly before, but they can absolutely go hand in hand. Fracking has reduced our emissions. It helps reduce countries around the world's emissions. It helps lift people out of poverty that are trying to rapidly industrialize. I just would have liked to see some more meat on that bone, I think, from the candidates.
Yeah, I was disappointed in the lack of attention to energy, which has been such a huge issue. The cost of it, the development of it, the Inflation Reduction Act pouring trillions of dollars into wind and solar, into unreliable intermittent sources.
Including right here in Colorado.
Right, exactly. Exactly. You're going to see a whole lot more wind and solar in Colorado now that the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. What did we call it? The Inflation Production Act. But you're going to, they want to put it in rural Colorado, of course, because no one in rural Colorado, or everyone in rural Colorado, is just openly embracing acres and acres and acres of solar farms and wind turbines. So yeah, that stuff matters in Colorado, but so does banning hydraulic fracturing. Oh my gosh! So you think you're going to replace the oil and gas industry with intermittent, weather-dependent, inefficient energy sources? Not even close.
Yeah, and I think folks in Colorado are particularly attuned to that. They probably get some PTSD when they hear that, because if you recall that bill that was introduced last session,
that's right.
There was a state effort to kind of do the same thing to a $48 billion industry here in the state. So this stuff really matters. Like you said, there were some things that were touched on we would like to see in a little bit more. Is there anything else you want to leave the listeners with?
No, that's, I think your last point about remembering that Colorado introduced essentially what was a fracking ban in the last legislative session. Thank you, Kevin Priola. California has done it too. Yeah. California has actually implemented it, yep. And it's
state of New York as well, I think, and
it's dangerous.
Yep.
It is. And I'll tell you what. You know what you see in California? You see skyrocketing prices. So because they have to get power from somewhere.
Yep. No, that's an absolutely great point. All right, as we're coming up on time here, Amy, did you have any takeaways that you wanted to leave with the listeners?
Yeah, I've got a couple. I managed to pull a few out for this episode. One is that, and I said it earlier in the show, I don't trust Kamala Harris flip-flopping on hydraulic fracturing. I think if she gets the opportunity as president, she would probably endorse a fracking ban and with pleasure sign one if it were a national one. So I don't trust her on that. And that would devastate my county of Weld County. 2, I'd be wary of any energy policy that mirrors Colorado and goes through the myopic lens of emissions and calls it climate policy rather than energy policy. If they say climate policy, they're putting you below everything else. It is not about human flourishing or human thriving. And then 3, if you're still in Colorado, get a generator, because regardless of who's president, we have to fix the state of Colorado. Get a generator.
Evergreen advice, as always, get your generators, folks. That does it for us on another episode of PowerGab. If you like what you saw here, you can head on over to iitv.org to check out our entire back catalog. We have a new episode every single week. We're also available wherever you get your audio podcasts, whether that's Spotify or Apple. And if you want to suggest future show topics or guests, we'd love to hear from our listeners. You can send those over to info@powergab.org. And until next week, we'll see you.